Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Newground Life and Leadership podcast. Today, I'm really pleased to be joined by Lauren Windle, who's an author, a presenter, a public speaker, has written for many different publications, ranging from The Sun, Marie Claire, the Huffington Post, Vogue magazine, and lots of others. It's great to be with you today, Lauren. Thanks for joining us and taking the time out.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited. I'm particularly excited because you've given me no indication of what we're going to talk
I
about,
know,
which
which is
I
sailing into the fog,
that's
which,
when the fun happens, isn't
I know. I
it?
mean, I was going to say I was really looking forward to talking with you today, which was true until I read that you brush your teeth with warm water. And I thought, what kind of person does that?
Why don't you
Um,
brush your teeth with warm water? We're recording this on a particularly cold day. Imagine what you would have felt this morning had you brushed your teeth with warm water. It's a hug in your mouth, a gift to yourself.
yeah, I mean, I have to say I'm judging it without trying it. I
Yeah,
will.
and that's wrong. You
Yeah,
wouldn't wash your dishes in cold water. Why wash your teeth in cold water, you know?
you can tell you work in media industry with the catchphrases and slogans like that. Everyone's going to be trying that. If people get nothing else from today's conversation, it'll be something to do with brushing teeth and warm water and
And you're welcome, because that's
yeah.
a gem, that one.
But I don't use soap to brush my teeth either, and I use
Toothpaste,
soap to brush.
presumably.
Yeah, but I use soap to wash my dishes. So there's a difference between the way I brush my teeth and the way I wash my dishes already. So this is just an extension of some of the differences between my,
Let's
I don't
really
brush.
dig into
I
this.
don't wash. I don't wash my dishes. I'm going to go that far. Like my dishwasher does,
Okay.
much to the
Okay.
irritation of my long-suffering wife.
If we were to extend this, then I would say that makes you an electric toothbrush man.
Yeah, I am an electric toothbrush man.
Well, there
Well
you
done.
go. There you go. But you can
I
still use warm water. Your dishwasher does not just pump through cold water. You know, I'm doubling down on this. You're missing a trick, and I'm
No, I'm just
sorry for
wondering.
you.
I'm just wondering if
It's
there's any research done on the correlation between dishwasher usage and electric toothbrushes, and
yeah.
whether or not there's a kind of aesthetic, monkish type simplicity that likes to, brush your teeth with manual labor rather than
I do
battery
manual
labor.
labor.
Yeah,
I manual labor my teeth. I put in the work myself, with the warm water, with the
yeah.
toothpaste. Sometimes I even floss. Far more, far,
Wow, I've
far
never
more
met a
infre-
flosser before. This is genuine. Like it's like talking to an American.
Oh, yeah, no, I floss because I went to the dentist and they just went on and on and on about flossing. And then I didn't do it for years. And then I was like, oh, no, actually, I think it probably does make a difference. So I'm a
Yeah.
convert.
Wow.
So,
I mean, but everyone gets guilted by the dentist, and that normally only lasts for a few weeks. It's like a New Year's resolution. I'll keep going
yeah,
for a bit and then I'll stop.
yeah.
Anyway, thanks for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. That's enough for now.
Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Yeah, that's the other thing, of course. You have a TED talk that's been viewed several 100,000 times, which is amazing. And maybe that's how we can get into the actual conversation. Your TED
Oh,
talk
yeah,
is about,
nice.
there we go. Your TED talk is about your journey to recovery. And I think I've heard you described elsewhere as a middle class cocaine addict or a middle class drug addict. Was that you or
Oh,
someone
that's
else?
so fun. I don't know who said
That's
that, but
Adrian Holloway, I think. It was like a catch, like a description of Lauren. I think I saw him introduce you like that or something. I don't know. No?
oh my gosh, I'm going to message Adrian immediately after this.
Oh no.
No,
I
I
don't even
think
know what that
that's,
means, by the way. What is a middle class drug addict as opposed to a working class drug addict? We can talk about that.
well,
Anyway, Lauren,
yeah.
tell us a bit about your life, and we'll edit out all of this so far. Your life and journey to faith and recovery and all that that means. Over to you.
Yeah, gosh. Okay. So, my life, yeah, I mean, that is a big question. So I was raised going to church. My mum took me to church, and that was very important to her. I didn't love church. I found church very difficult. Didn't feel like the sort of welcoming environment that it should have, I think. And when I was 13, I was given the choice whether or not I stay or go. And I was like, great, I'm not going back, because I was old enough to stay at home on my own. My mum felt I was old enough to make that decision for myself. So I opted out. And then I found like the world, as it were, that not that I hadn't already found it, but sort of teenager in London, lots of drinking, smoking, out with your friends, lying to your parents about where you were, all of the stuff that's really sort of standard for teenagers. Certainly it was for like people in my circle. And that meant that you could display quite problematic behavior, but you were hiding in plain sight, because for me and my friendship group, it was totally normal to get drunk and then throw up, or to, just to do all of those things that actually I would consider now to be like, not very fruitful, but at the time, totally normal, go for it. Then I went to university, and obviously, if you want to drink in an alcoholic like way, university is the absolute dream, because it's cheap, it's encouraged, socializing is based around drinking. There's very little that doesn't involve drinking and 50p shots and bar crawls and club nights, So I carried on drinking in that way. I got into a relationship which was quite a destructive relationship. There was a lot of codependency. He was a very big drinker as well. And things were really quite miserable at that time. And I think maybe because I was young, I didn't realize how miserable they were, because I didn't know what other options were available, the level of misery everyone else was experiencing. And I kind of just assumed that like this was the level to expect. Sometimes you're happy, often when you're drunk, and sometimes you're not, often when you're hungover, and that is the cycle of life. But we broke up, and he broke up with me around my 22nd birthday, and I then had just left university, had just broken up with this person who I had absolutely made my whole life, and I saw myself as his wife with his kids and our dogs, and living like, somewhere just outside of London. And all of that was gone. And then I got a job in hospitality, and I was an events manager for some venues in London, which is quite a sort of work hard, play hard environment. And there was a lot of drinking. And then someone offered me some cocaine. And it just like, there was no reason, I felt, for me to say no to that. I wanted to keep drinking in the way that I had. I didn't want to stop drinking. So like I took it, and actually cocaine facilitates drinking. It means that you can drink more without sort of blacking out or throwing up. So that was really exciting to me to have discovered it. I felt out of control with cocaine quite quickly. I think it's very easy, particularly in our culture, when you're drinking a lot, to deny that you have a problem, because this is the classic one, like, yeah, but Jeff drinks more than me. And it's like, yeah, Jeff's probably a bit of an alcoholic, to be honest. Like, who are we comparing ourselves to? You can always name someone who drinks more than you. You can always come up with a reason, like, yeah, but I don't like wake up and put vodka on my cornflakes. Like, actually, that's not what problem drinking and the term alcoholic is actually a little bit outdated, but in sort of like general media, it tends to be the word that we use. But these days in medical research and things, it would be alcohol use disorder. And people who display signs of alcohol use disorder are not, the bar is actually far closer to what we would consider like a fun time than a lot of people realize. But when it comes to cocaine, I think it's very hard to say like, oh no, this is normal usage, because you are now taking a class A drug that's very expensive, that, completely, it's mind altering in a completely different way, and is far less socially acceptable. So I spiraled with that quite quickly. And that, I'd say, catalyzed my destructive behavior. I think without cocaine, and I'm kind of grateful for it, and what a weird thing to say, but like without cocaine, I think I'd still be drinking now. I think I'd be drinking into my 50s before I actually accepted that alcohol was a problem in my life, even though it definitely was. But I would have found it very hard to give up without a very serious reason. And cocaine came along and was that reason. So I ended up, you know, with numbness in my fingers and toes. I got like this facial twitch, and all of this was just so I could be fabulous and glamorous and party with the big boys and you know, meet people who went to members clubs, and anything I could possibly be impressed by was what I was trying to be a part of, and all of that kind of stuff. And actually, like, it was really miserable. And what started off as a, you know, theoretically fabulous night ended with me sitting at the table on my own in my kitchen, smoking cigarettes, drinking straight out of a bottle of wine, and doing lines of cocaine and wondering where everyone went, you know. And it's really, really desperately miserable. I didn't wash properly. Every now and again I would like have a proper shower and clean myself, and then put on moisturizer and put on clean clothes, and I'd be like, yes, that's me. I have got myself together today. I'm, you know, really on track. And this is what it feels like to reclaim your life, and this is a line in the sand. And I probably did that like twice a year. That's how often I actually took that level of care of myself. And yeah, and then I got nosebleeds, and I wasn't opening my mail, and I was letting down friends, and I was not turning up to things after I said I would. I like, in the end, just couldn't make breakfast or brunch plans because I just wouldn't show up, because I'd still be drinking from the night before, you know. And then I guess there are probably two defining moments in my story that made me make positive changes. And the first was, I'd been out with some friends. One of them had moved to Paris because she was dating a guy who lived in France. And to celebrate her like being back in London, we went to a French restaurant, and she translated something on the menu for me that I couldn't read. And I was like, oh my goodness, that is so cool that she can speak French now. And then I went off and met my dealer and picked up 2 grams of cocaine. And then I was like, okay, I'm gonna hit the town with these guys tonight. It's a Thursday night, you know, like we'll probably go for a drink and then head to a club. But when I got back from picking up, the friends that I was having dinner with were like, oh, it's 10:30, you know, ooh, tired. I think I'm gonna head home, because they're normal people, you know. And on a Thursday night, a 10:30 dinner finish, quite frankly, to me is obscene, you know. But then I was like, what? It's 10:30. We shouldn't be heading back till at least 2 o'clock. So I went home on my own, called an ex-boyfriend, and we sat up together taking these 2 grams. There's like, as an addict, once you've got 2 grams of cocaine in your hand, it doesn't matter if the circumstances change. You don't pocket them and go, oh, well, that's for the weekend then. You take them. And I went home and I sat up and I did my last line just as my alarm went off to tell me to get up and go into work. And I just called my boss and said, I'm not coming in, I'm high. And I think she could see that wasn't just, I mean, it was a reckless employee making awful decisions and being very unprofessional, but also she could see that I was unwell. So she said, okay, you know, you're fine, you're ill today. I'm going to call you, I get some sleep. I'm going to call you at the end of the day, and we're going to talk about this. But I think I knew I had gone too far that time. And I called my sister, and she's the prodigal who stuck around. And I said, like, can you come over after work? And she came over at sort of 5:30 or something. And I just said, like, I'm taking cocaine and I don't know how to stop. So she moved me out of my flat and moved me in with her, and she took me to church. And then on the Monday, she sent me into work with a pre-typed resignation letter, told me to hand that in because it was so inbuilt in the culture of my work, and she felt that was really unhelpful. And then she said, well, what are you going to do now? And the last time I remember being happy or impressed before that absolute crash and burn was when my friend translated a French word on a menu. So I said, I'm moving to Paris, having never been to Paris. And I packed 2 suitcases. And this is pre-Brexit, so you could rock up then without any visa or anything. Sorry, I just took a very audible sip of water. Yeah, and I rocked up and I set up a life for myself in Paris, and I was still drinking very heavily there, but I couldn't get access to drugs. I didn't have a drug dealer. I didn't speak the language, but then that started to change. Sorry. Then that started to change after about 9 months or so. And I started dating someone who worked in a restaurant nearby, and he would finish his shift at midnight and then come over and he would have drugs. And my friends who were there, they weren't drug takers. They drank, sure, but in like quite a sensible French, I like the taste of this, so I'll have a glass of it kind of a way, not in my like, whoa, binge drinking kind of way. And they said, like, we can't sit with you while you continuously make these mistakes and you continuously cry about this and you continuously sort of crash and burn. And you've made this step of moving here, but we can see that you're going straight back down that path. So we want you to go to a support group meeting for cocaine addicts. And I went, like, just to stop them going on at me. I was like, yeah, sure, fine. If this is going to buy me another 2 months where you're not going to like tell me off, then I will. But I think I genuinely was in danger of losing them. So I turned up at this meeting and it was a bilingual meeting, but I remember standing at the door and thinking, like, okay, they're all speaking French. I'm just going to go. I'm not going to be able to do this. And then I was just about to walk down the stairs to leave. And then there was a lift, and the lift doors open, and this woman came out and said something to me in French. And I was like, oh no, I don't speak French. And she said in English, are you here for the meeting? And I said, oh, I was going to go to the meeting, but I think it's actually not for me. I think maybe they're speaking French and I'm probably in the wrong place. And she just like scooped up my arm, linked my arm in hers and said, okay, you can sit next to me. And sort of very gently walked me into the room and sat me next to her. And there were a few things that day that were like undoubtedly God. And that was the first. And then what I thought would be like excellent voyeurism, like a good story to tell at the pub, that I'd been to one of those meetings that you see in like American movies, like, hi, my name's Lauren and I'm an addict. But actually, like, I just cried the whole time when they were talking. And there were a lot of women there who were around my age, maybe marginally older. They were in their 20s and they were about 3 months sober. So it was just out of touching distance. And yeah, and I just cried and cried. And then they said, did I want to share anything at the end? And I did. And I just said, like, I just need help. I can't keep doing this. And then they took me for lunch afterwards. And I remember as I was walking to the lunch, I thought, like, oh my goodness, I hope that there's wine at this lunch. Spoiler alert, there wasn't. And they were like, I asked them, can I give up cocaine and still drink? And they did not like give me an inch, because I would have taken it. They just said, no, we really don't believe that you'll be able to do this if you still drink. We think it is really helpful to stop all mind-altering substances. And one of the women, completely unprompted, turned to me and was like, do you know what? I moisturize every day now. And to me, that was God, because like I just prized moisturizing so highly. That day when I washed and moisturized was like, that's the day that I could take on the world, that I've, finally not a complete mess. And the idea of being that person every day, I was like, oh my goodness, I can have that, like that is possible for me. So I left and I called my sister and said, look, they want me to stop drinking. And she was just like, do it. I think that would be the best thing you've ever done in your life. And that was it. I didn't have a last line of cocaine, a big blowout, a final night, last glass of wine or Bacardi Breezer, or I didn't drink Bacardi Breezers, but you know what I mean? Like I just stopped. And every day was like, okay, but what's going to be the moment when I drink again? And like this sort of white knuckling, and I just lay on the sofa watching Disney films, because at least I knew what the ending would be, so there'd be no horrible surprises. And I felt so vulnerable and so like anything could happen and I'd be bruised. And I left my sofa literally only to go to one meeting a day, because I decided I was going to do 90 meetings in 90 days, which is what they recommend for someone when they first come into sobriety, to kind of immerse themselves in that world rather than the world of their addiction and their addictive behavior. And that I'd say is probably when my life started.
Wow. Congratulations
Thank
for
you.
sobriety. How long has it been now?
So that was on the 22nd of April 2014. So by the
Nearly 6
time
years.
this,
Wow.
no, well,
8.
coming up to 9.
No, my maths is brilliant. Yeah.
Wow.
Great.
Thank you, Carol Vorderman. Yeah.
I can give you consonants and vowels as well if you want.
Yes, no, but this year April will be 9. Yeah, so it's
That's
ticking along.
amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So let's pause there because I have lots of questions about this. So you defined addictive. So help me to understand, because what's the difference between being addicted to something and it being a disorder? Because we're all in some respects addicted to something. We choose our substance, but I'm not. Sugar doesn't seem to ruin my life in the way that alcohol ruins people's lives, and yet I would rarely go a day without having lots of sugar in my food in various
Yeah.
forms. So you use the phrase about a disorder. Help me to
Mm,
understand how people can recognize, because kind of linked to that, I suppose, is the great phrase you used about the cycle of life that seems to be the kind of, the student, or this I would just say the kind of secular cycle of life. If it's not alcohol, it's experience. We just go from one to
mm,
another and we think, okay, I just have to live with the hangover, particularly when you're in your early 20s or late teens. I remember that very clearly, thinking
mm,
this is what life is. If people told me this is what I should do at uni, so this is what I'm doing, and now this
mm,
isn't actually that much fun, but I can't really acknowledge that because it's what we're supposed to do, because that's the cycle of
mm,
life. And is it kind of like getting trapped in this is what we do, to realizing this is disordered? And that phrase disordered, I
mm.
think, is quite interesting as well. Talk to me a bit about your reflections on some of that.
Um, so medically, there's no difference between like alcohol use disorder and alcohol addiction, right? But what we're kind of talking about here is in terms of I think it's different when you're framing things in a spiritual sense. Because in spiritual terms, we talk about idolatry. And if idolatry were a scale from 1 to 10, and in a perfect world, everything would be at a 1 apart from God, that would be at a 10, right? No one's got that balance bar Jesus, right? So what you can do is take those things in your life that prompt a dopamine release, that are things that some in moderation are good, but that we can use in order to cheer ourselves up or console ourselves, or to when we're lonely or tired or whatever. And sometimes actually what we're talking about on those scale are things that really aren't good anyway, and it'd be a world where we just abstain from those things would actually be more healthy for us. So you could write a list of those things, like sugar, like alcohol, like money, like gambling for some people, like spending money and shopping, like sex, like pornography, like any other substance that people may be using. And you can draw out that scale and you can mark where you're at with each of those things. So for me, for example, I'm a 10 when it comes to alcohol, which means it has to be an abstinence like substance for me. Whereas for people who are like a 2, like sure, enjoy a glass of wine and stuff like that. That's legitimate, and there's no reason for you to sort of go to abstinence and take it off the scale altogether. Whereas I'd argue something like pornography, even if you feel you're in control of your sort of pornography use and it's just every now and again and blah blah blah, I'd say, like, from my opinion and a lot of research, I'd say take that one off the scale altogether, regardless of where you're at, and be in an abstinence place with that. Whereas money, like, I'm actually super healthy with money. So I'd say I'm a 2, maybe at times a 3, something to prey on every now and again, definitely room for improvement. But I've never been that's never become an idol in my life, right? So it's knowing yourself and knowing where you're at with those things. And yes, you can be an 8 with sugar or a 9 with sugar, and it's unlikely, like, to cause behavioral problems for you, or to put distance between you and your family and your connections, your relationships, which means, you know, it's not such a big deal that you abstain from it, even though you're an 8 or a 9. But actually, like, in terms of a spiritual sense, if that's something that has a hold on you, then that's still a very big deal. Like, we are given freedom. Jesus died so that we can have freedom. And if you're genuinely, and I know that this may sound a bit silly, but if you're a slave to sugar, if you cannot go a day without eating it, and if after a meal it's all you think about and blah, 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 whether you're overweight or diabetic or not, you know, whether you currently are experiencing physical symptoms from an overconsumption of sugar, actually, like, do you want that? Do you, you know, like, I think it's important that we embrace the freedom and the life to its fullest, and handing over your freedom to anything like other than God, in that sort of, you know, humble submission, and because he's the one that can be trusted with it, whereas sugar, it can't be, you know, or alcohol can't be, and blah blah blah. You know, that's kind of where I stand on it. So like, yeah.
No, it's really helpful. And in some respects, it'd be useful to people almost take an itinerary of their lives when it comes to high intensity dopamine releasing activities, whether it is those things or computer games or screen addiction, phone usage, all of that. I think there's something really sensible that we could all do and take an itinerary of our lives. But so a couple of thoughts prompted from what you said is, so the Apostle Paul said it's for freedom that Christ has set you free. Do not be subject to a yoke of slavery again, therefore. And there's in kind of concepts of freedom, there's an understanding it's not just freedom from addiction, it's freedom for something else. And so often what our society lacks is a clear understanding of what we've been set free for. Like freedom isn't an end in itself. And almost then to come to what you said, that freedom is for intimate connection with another, and all of the things that you listed that were problematic about your alcohol usage is that it was destroying connection with people. And actually why perhaps we, particularly as Christians, would take the approach we would to pornography, to say there's no acceptable use for this, because it's always going to create disconnection. It's always going to make it harder for you to relate to the you know, opposite sex, or the sex that you're fantasizing about. And so there's problems there. And I, again, in your TED talk that I watched, you quoted someone where you said the opposite to addiction is not sobriety, but loving connection.
Yeah, that's Joanne Harry, who he wrote that in his book Chasing the Scream, but also actually has a TED talk which is vastly more popular than mine, where he says that. And I do, and I think he's 100% right. I mean, like, I think if you're in a place where you have lost yourself to an addiction where you can practice abstinence, then abstinence and sobriety are very important in building up those connections. But it is, you know, I've worked now with addicts for like 7 years of the 9-ish that I've been sober. And what I find, particularly in their backstory, in their origin story, like them at school and blah, 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 is that they didn't know who they were, which is why you get such high rates of addiction in the LGBTQ plus community. Because if somebody is struggling with gender identity or is struggling with sexuality, feeling that, you know, like, oh, where have these feelings come from? Who am I? Am I a gay person? Am I a straight person? Blah, blah, blah. Actually, a lack of identity really causes issues. A lack of sort of community, of loving community, can cause a lot of issues as well, and a lack of purpose. So if somebody like doesn't know who they are, what they're a part of, and what they're about, that's when we get problems. And all three of those things are so perfectly satisfied in Christ in a way that I haven't seen in any other, you know, like, and I try very hard not to force my faith onto people who feel very resentful towards the church, or who don't want to practice that sort of religion. But I'll always be very honest with them about what I've seen. And I do think you can find sobriety, and good sobriety, without being Christian, without loving Jesus, but I wouldn't have wanted to try. And I think that what I have is so enriched because I think those three things are satisfied in my life in him. And that's an ongoing journey. You know, you never feel completely, you know, you have to continuously build that connection with God.
And this is where I think perhaps this is what something would be interesting to come on to talk about is often people find sobriety through a higher power that helps them realize their own limitations and the need for another, a divine power to help them. I think the research suggests that you almost can't become free from addiction without realizing your powerlessness over the substance and your need for help from outside. Often spirituality and addiction and recovery are very closely linked. But what strikes me is kind of interesting is that idols don't offer connection because they're not loving. Ultimately, we endow them with principles and powers to help us, but in Christ, the only God who is fully loving is able to meet that deep need for connection. But my question for you is, how did your life up until the point where you went to that group, how were you, what were you self-medicating against, that kind of loss of connection that you were looking for in the substances, in cocaine?
I had always felt what I can now identify as social anxiety, but we're talking about 2005, say, when I was at school and drinking heavily. So that language I wouldn't have known then. And I found alcohol to be an incredible solution to that problem. In that I was just, it's not that it went, it's not that I was suddenly not worried about what people thought of me and if I was welcome and all of that kind of stuff, but it's just that I didn't have to think about it because I was drunk, you know, quite frankly, and distracted. And that's what I wanted. And even though that is the shortest of short-term solutions, that actually just piles the problem on more heavily the following day, it was a solution nonetheless. And in my sort of short-term gains kind of mindset, that would do, because I didn't have a longer term solution that I felt I could tap into. And I do think the language and the education around that has changed dramatically since I was 14, you know, and there is far more conversation around that in schools and things. And I hope that is very helpful. So I'd say social anxiety, just this, everything I did was to be popular. I was just so afraid of being on my own and being unpopular and being unliked and what that would mean for me, you know. And it just meant that I didn't have to think about that anymore, that wasn't rattling around in my brain. But very much my solution to that was alcohol. And then the cocaine facilitated the alcohol use. And I wouldn't have known that at the time either, because I thought my problem was cocaine, when really I think my primary addiction was alcohol, and it was just exacerbated by the cocaine use.
So, I mean, I guess the social anxiety thing is partly why so many, the teenage culture is to just get drunk, because it kind of lowers that fear of what others think. And I can just, you know, let go of these kind of constant. And what's interesting is that, you know, those internal safeguards, or that shyness filter, is actually there to help us, but society tells us you've got to just let that go, and you've just got to be free, you've got to throw off all restraints and actually bypass and override many of your natural instincts towards pulling back and reservation. And that's quite fascinating. I don't know if this is a segue, but Louise Perry's book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, have you read that or come across her?
I've not, but I've come across her a lot. And it's a funny one, because I feel like the world would tell me to dislike her and push against some of the stuff she's saying, but she's blown my mind in some ways. And there's some stuff she says about Christianity, despite the fact she's not Christian, as far as I know. Obviously I don't see into people's hearts, like that. I'm just like, has completely reframed how I've thought about sex, which is just, can I tell you my favorite thing that I've heard her say? Yes, great, because that's what we're here for. It was on trigonometry. She was a guest on Trigonometry, a podcast, and I heard her talking, and she talks, as you say, about the sexual revolution. And at one point she said, oh, when I talk about this stuff, sometimes people ask me which sexual revolution I'm talking about. And she's like, well, my area of research, the thing I'm talking about is the sort of 1970s, 60s, 70s kind of, where previously women were expected to be monogamous and men were, it was permissible, to sort of sleep with a lot of people. So if you're looking at two separate bell curves, one is, I realize that the vast majority of people will be listening to this rather than seeing me, but one is here, down here, and one is up here, right? So the men is higher up on the scale and the women is lower down. And that's how things have been, right? And actually what the sexual revolution in the 60s, 70s did was told women that they should push their bell curve up so it matches men. So they should have, be free, have the same sex. And in many ways, that's caused more damage to women in the long term, because the consequences of pregnancy are very clearly far more for a woman, and various other things that she cited as reasons why actually that's not ideal. Now, there's another sexual revolution, and that was post Jesus, right? In like 100 AD or around that time, okay? And the Christian sexual revolution took those two bell curves, the women down here expecting the sort of in the Greco-Roman society that we're talking about, particularly high net worth women were expected monogamy, and that's for reasons of paternal certainty. And that's been like every society. Women can't, I'm just going to say a sort of slang word for sex, sleep around. So I'll keep it PG. Women can't sleep around because then we won't know who the father of these kids are, and we need the sons to inherit, and that has to all be certain, right? Men, on the other hand, particularly high net worth men, had access to like just hordes of slave women who were in prostitution, involuntarily in prostitution, and probably other access to sex that whatever. And that was acknowledged, and that was fine. Also, they had access to young male boys in that society specifically as well, and that was permissible, provided that they weren't receiving anything into their body. Otherwise that is the feminine role. So that was that for the sort of high net worth men. Right. What the Christian Revolution did was offer equality, but in the opposite direction. It demanded monogamy from the men as well. So that bell curve, it's not that the bell curves matched up by telling the women, no, you can also sleep around, have your own slaves. It pushed the bell curve down for everyone by saying, yes, we want women to commit to one man, but we want men to commit to one woman. We don't want you to sleep with someone who is not your wife. We want you to commit to loving them and building a family with them. And that was revolutionary. And to me, actually, there's something deeply feminine, like that's equal. That's feminist. That is protecting the rights of women and the consequences of sex for women, whilst making them the same as men. And when I heard that, I was like, oh my gosh, how cool's Jesus? Like, this is what I want. This is what I'm talking about. I'm trying so hard to find ways that feminism and Christianity marry up. And it's literally right there, and I just thought that was just mind-blowingly great.
That is superb. Love that. And love that we've gone from, talking about addiction to now. Let's talk about attitude towards sex over history and feminism, which is superb. But even as you were saying that, you're right. In the ancient world, sex was really about power, and so the unforgivable sin was to be the passive partner, to be the dominated partner in sex. Even in homosexual practice, that was the sin, was to be the passive partner in the exchange. And that's not the right word for it, is it? Oh, sorry, my phone. Oh goodness. Mike, are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here.
I'm sorry. My wife is now phoning me, and I don't, it's come right through to my computer and blocked everything. Go away. I can't really say go away. I'm just going to, okay, fine. Sorry. That's weird. I'm gonna have to, Here we go, back. Sorry, yeah. So it was about power and domination, and what
Yeah.
seems to, in part, what happened with the Christian Revolution was the value of humanity was
Mm,
brought to the forefront,
mm,
and it became about equal value, worth, honor, respect, love,
mm,
and responsibility. And it's interesting that there's a move in our age to try to reframe everything again around the imbalance of power. But
mm,
I think as Christians we have to be careful, because talking constantly and only in terms of power imbalances
mm,
is almost where we came from. We actually need to talk much more about the intrinsic value and worth of one another, and call men to take You're right, women are the much more vulnerable partner in sex, and so the onus is always on men to take more responsibility. But
mm.
anyway, I'm waffling and going down rabbit holes in thought, but this has been an interesting segue and journey. I've used the word segue several times already. But yeah, we're big fans of Louise Perry. But the reason I mentioned her in the first place was because she talks in her book really about how a lot of the modern messaging towards women, particularly with the kind of the popularity of the 50 Shades of Grey and stuff like that,
Mm,
is that they should override their kind of shyness and disgust sensibilities towards sexual practice, and just push through and just be as promiscuous and as free as men are in their expression of their sexuality. And actually her point is that instinct towards disgust or shyness, or what prudishness is the old-fashioned word for it, that's
mm,
actually valuable and should be listened to.
mm,
And I guess there's a long-winded, rounded way of coming back to what you were talking about with social anxiety, thinking that's there
mm,
for a reason, because there's a desire in you for proper connection and intimacy, but there's also a recognition this is hard fought for, and how do we do
mm,
this? And we think, well, if I
mm,
can just bypass like putting the hours in and working through the awkwardness of trying to connect with another person and feel settled and accept myself, if I can bypass that with a substance, then that will
mm,
set me free and release all of these inhibitions and fears that I have. And that, in part, I guess, is what substance misuse does for people, is it
mm.
kind of dulls those senses. And actually those senses, her contention, my ramble, her contention is that those are valuable and we should listen to them. They're
I think that we have those instincts for a reason. And actually, I it's a funny one, isn't it? Because I think part of that is just biological. God has inbuilt that for us. And then if you are a practicing Christian with that sort of ever-growing, hopefully, connection and relationship with God, hopefully you're tuned into the sort of what the Holy Spirit is telling you. And yeah, sometimes you feel a bit panicked, you feel a bit fight or flight, you feel a bit like just deep down, like this stirring, like, oh, why does this feel so wrong? And that's a reason, I mean, to get out of whatever that situation is. And whether that's get out for today and reflect on it, and if you're like, okay, no, I just freaked out, I'll do this tomorrow, then fine. But actually sometimes that's yeah, you really regret pushing through that when in the cold light of day, when you've had a bit more time to reflect on it, and you kind of wish that you had listened to that instinct, that gut feeling, that Holy Spirit feeling, depending on sort of where you're at.
mm. So I want to come on to talk about your book on singleness, but before we do that, I just want to you're there in that recovery room in Paris, that first meeting, and you said you wanted to go with a bit of a voyeur, you went with a voyeuristic instinct. Let's get some good stories, but which is beautifully honest. But you found yourself crying,
Mm.
and that it's we can all kind of appreciate why you might do that, but just talk me through, like, as you reflected on that moment, what were the tears about and for, and what did you see in that room that brought out that emotion, and how did that play a big part in your recovery?
I had already used the word addict to describe myself probably a year or so before this moment. So it wasn't wild to me, but I think I'd used it as like for impact. I don't think I truly believed it. I think I'd said it as in like, well, maybe I'm an addict, in arguments and stuff like that. but I think it was just this release. It was this moment of realization that the words that they were saying were so familiar to me, even though we'd never met, and anyone who's been through something that has caused or is just sort of traumatic, anyone who's had a very difficult diagnosis, or has experienced grief and loss, or addiction, or any number of things, it's like a magic trick when you sit down with people who've experienced the same and they start talking, particularly when you haven't taken the time to do any sort of like introspection or journaling or therapy about it. And people who are just a couple of stages ahead, where they have thought some of these things through, they have thought through their actions, they have thought through how they have hurt themselves and others, and they speak from that posture. And you're like, I never would have thought to put those words to it, but you know me, you're me. And it's just so spectacular, and it's freeing. And it's, the thing about addiction is that it's in the dark, and you lie about it. And even if some people know some things, no one knows everything. And it's just like you live in a cage that you've built around yourself, and you hate yourself for it, and you don't know if there's a way to break out. And then you're sitting there, and there are people there who know that, who've lived that, and who offer you hope. And it's like, it's like someone released a valve, and it was incredibly transformational for me.
That's brilliant. I love the way you put that. And actually there's a lot of crossover to how someone might experience their first time at church, say, or any gathering like that. If there's an honesty in the room, in the way that Christian faith is being expressed, it should tap into those similar instincts in others that have arrived and thought, oh, you feel this too, and oh, I can let my guard down, and someone hears me and knows me. Because I think you're right, we all rush around in these kind of just whirlwind of activity to mask a lot of the inner aching loneliness and sadness that we feel. But when you do meet people, you think, and you use the phrase, they were just 3 months ahead of me, and so they were within touching distance. When you see something, you think, oh, you're like me, but like a better version of me, the me I'd like to be. Then you start to believe I could do that too. And that's perhaps the danger in if we're talking Christian terms, where we put polished leaders on a stage or a platform, or people who've got their lives together, or people who are experts at religion and Christianity, because they're almost too far removed from the experience of someone coming from a post-Christian culture that has no understanding of faith. They enter a room and think, well, these guys are so far ahead or so different from me, I can't ever be like that. And maybe that's an interesting place to kind of move. You avoided using the word segue. Move towards a conversation about marriage and singleness, because the subtitle of your book is dating in a marriage obsessed church. And so even just kind of as we approach that as a subtitle and a subject, and I'd love to get your thoughts on that. But as people enter church, if they are unmarried, they approach a culture that they see as people who are obsessed with marriage and very different from them, not like them. They think, well, I'm not like these people. In fact, my culture doesn't really revere that marriage in the way that this subculture seems to do that. It's creating further obstacles and hurdles between ourselves and people who are coming to faith for the first time. Let's talk about your book, and let's talk about what prompted you to write it. Let's go with that.
Well, I mean, so when did I pitch the book? I must have been 30, which is in society a sort of like milestone age when it comes to relationships. Particularly women will cite 30 as like, oh, I have to be married by the time I'm 30, or this is what I want, and you hear people say like, oh, I want to have this job or earn this much or blah, blah, blah. So I think I was probably feeling quite reflective about stages of life and this expectation to be at certain stages of life. But also by then I'd been in the church for a good sort of 4 years, 5 maybe by then. 5. And I'd seen how people spoke about marriage, and I'd seen what I felt was this disparity between how married people in the church were treated and how single people in the church were treated. And it didn't seem very represented. And there are some people who represent it very well, and some people who do take the time to speak about it from the front. And I know that there are people for whom it is like a real passion, whether they're married or not. But on the whole, I think if you were to survey 200 single people who went to a variety of denominations of Christian church, they would say that they don't feel that the challenges and the at times pain and disappointment and disheartening that they feel around being single and dating are represented from the front of church. They've never had anyone preach on it. So then I started looking around at like what's actually available, and I found a lot of books geared towards women, a lot of books with women skipping through fields on the cover, or books about putting into God in the waiting, and practicing perfect patience, and praying for your husband. And I'm not criticizing the theological grounding of those. I think we should pull in to God when we're waiting for anything that we're praying for. And if you would like a husband, there's nothing wrong with praying for a husband. But I did not feel represented by these books. And the conversations I was having with my friends, both male and female, in the church, over coffee or down at the pub after a service or something, were like fun and funny. And oh my goodness, who said what? And you're on this dating app. And it was like we kind of enjoyed the journey together, but then also were really honest about the pain of it. Like, I actually thought that was going to go somewhere, and I'm gutted, and I'm going to take a little break, and all of those kind of conversations. But it was always, and yes, God is at the center of those conversations, but they weren't super like spiritual and holy. It's just normal like lifestyle stuff, and I couldn't find it anywhere. So I wrote it. I tried to sort of marry up the hilarity of outrageous first dates where people do some of the most ridiculous things with the disappointment of a breakup when you actually had sort of thought that could end in marriage, and many, many other things in between, as well as actually just taking time to recognize and celebrate being single, because the whole point of being single is not to get married, to level up. It's to enjoy, whether it's for now or forever, all of the perks that come with being single, and feel supported in embracing the challenges. And that's what we talk to married people about all the time. Like, oh my gosh, you're so going to love this, and this about being married. These things we find difficult, but here's a marriage course. Here's an older married couple. Here's a load of very helpful books on how other people have tackled that. It's like we forgot to celebrate the perks of being single. And to be honest, wishing it away is such a shame, because there'll be times when someone wished away their whole time being single, got married, had a couple of kids, cleaning up some sort of poo somewhere, and they're like, I love this, and I love the stage I'm at, and I love my family, and I love my children, but I wish I'd appreciated the fact that I didn't have to clean up poo when I was single, and I could just leave the house, and my money was my own, and it wasn't taken up by ballet classes and petrol to drop kids at various different places, and having to heat every room in the house because you can't have a cold house when you've got kids, or whatever it is. Actually, whilst there are so many things to be celebrated about marriage and starting a family, my goodness, should we be enjoying the time before that responsibility?
I'm just still enjoying your phrase. You find yourself cleaning up some sort of poo somewhere. Presumably from one of your children, but you never know.
Well,
or a dog, or an animal,
Gosh.
or just some random person's poo that you find yourself cleaning up. That's
Maybe you didn't make it to the toilet in time because of all of your childcare responsibilities. Yeah, no, in my mind, I was picturing a child.
I know you were, but I enjoyed the phrase. Thank you for that. I mean, the clip that I heard from your book was hilarious and tragic, and maybe sums up part of why you wrote the book, which was of a couple that were going on a first date, and they met at a tube station. Why don't you tell this story? Because I just thought that was shocking, terrifying, and yet also kind of symbolic of the church's attitude towards relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've called them in the book Jack and Rose, if I remember correctly, because the date sunk like the Titanic. But yeah, so Rose was waiting at the tube station and someone came over and said to her, "Oh, can I just talk to you about your Lord and Savior Jesus Christ?" And she was like, "Oh, do you know what? I already know him. Like, thank you so much." And then they had sort of a polite conversation. And then Jack turned up for the date and walked over to Rose and was like, "Oh, hey, should we head off?" kind of thing. And this woman said to him, "Can I introduce you to your Lord Savior Jesus Christ?" And he said, "Oh, I'm Christian already. Like, thank you so much. So nice to meet a fellow lover of Jesus." They start to leave. She insists on walking them through a prayer of salvation, despite it being clear that they are already practicing Christians. And then she prays over their date and their relationship. And I remember having this conversation when I was chatting to, it was Rose who told me the story. And she was like genuinely worried she was about to pray for her womb. But she didn't. And that was it. And then they went off for this date like a bit shell-shocked because they
That was their
literally had
first
just
date.
yeah, they just agreed to grab a coffee and see if there was anything more than friendship in it. And suddenly someone was blessing their like marriage and stuff. And they were like, well, this is a lot, isn't it? And they never had a second date. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of like very well-meaning, very caring people in the church will sidle up next to you and be like, "Oh, when's it your turn?" And you're like, "Doris, if I knew that, I would tell you, and "Oh, you're getting yourself out there." Like, yes, I'm genuinely like doing my best. And like, or I tell you the one that the men often get that feels quite suffocating is like, "Well, why aren't you dating?" Almost as if there's a war effort that the men should be helping towards, when actually there are a lot of factors that will determine whether or not you're in the right place to date. And maybe you are dating, but you don't want to tell, Jean, who's at the 10:30. You want to sort of take some time and process that before you broadcast it. So yeah, they can sort of feel that pressure. And there are a lot of churches, some of them deliberately and some of them subconsciously, who just elevate married couples in a way they don't single people. And things like church planting. I have a friend who's a single woman and just feels that church planting is on her heart, but she's never seen anyone who isn't married do it. And what a shame that there could be a church out there that she's called to, but she feels so reluctant to do it without a husband, when actually I think there's wisdom in not doing it as a solo person. But why not a collection or two single people or friends or something, and it's just not, from her experience, it's just not been modeled, because people look for married couples to do things like that, and they raise up and they invest in and mentor married couples and propel them into those positions in a way they don't with single people.
I mean, you think the Apostle Paul did a all right job, didn't he? Planting churches as a single person.
Yeah. Do you know who was a good single person? Jesus. Like,
I always forget that.
Yeah. Like, fully human, lived in the most best fulfilled human life. Did he take a wife? No, he didn't. So how important is that to a fulfilled lived experience? Like, and I do often have to caveat what I say by saying, like, a marriage is great and it's important and it should be celebrated and it should be marked, but it shouldn't be elevated over people who are single, whether that is for now or a deliberate decision to remain single in order, as you say, to invest that time in God.
It's interesting. I mean, it's interesting you made that comment about church planting and church leadership as well, because I do think there's probably also a similar problem that we have when it comes to married couples and putting so much burden on marriages and married couples in leadership. I think there's a popular kind of king and queen model that happens accidentally sometimes in church. Like, well, he's the pastor and that's his wife, and so she's the queen, and so she's also.
I call my pastor's wife the first lady.
Yeah, well, exactly. There is that, which for some women that's entirely appropriate. They want that responsibility. They've got a gift of leadership. But in a lot of cases, you think, well, no, I'm married to someone who's an elder in this church. That doesn't mean that I want to be, I don't want my household to be the first family and to have all of that scrutiny that's placed on me and my family and my children. There's a degree of scrutiny that's always going to come with leadership because of the character requirements for Christian leadership. But equally, in doing that, we place unhealthy expectations on marriages and families. But as you rightly said, we overlook the gift of leadership in single men and single women because they're not in a couple, and because we can't make kings and queens out of them. And I just find that's a fascinating kind of observation I have when I look at churches and leadership. And but that's talking about leadership. So one of my questions is it that the church is obsessed with marriage, or is it that our culture is obsessed with relationships? And what's your reflections on that and the difference between the way our culture approaches romance and relationships, and then the kind of contrasts and good bits about the church or whatever?
Gosh, I mean, I don't think our culture is obsessed with marriage. We are obsessed with relationships, happy endings, love, and you can see that from the biggest dating shows in the sort of in the world at the moment. If you don't get proposed to in the Love is Blind pods, you don't make it through to the next stages of the show. If you decide that your relationship in Married at First Sight isn't a goer, then you're no longer on the show anymore. If you don't couple up in Love Island, you're no longer on the show anymore. There's no model where healthy singleness is celebrated. And those shows are deliberately there to make matches and to entertain with hilariously catty interactions between contestants and guests, as it were. So that's a model that they found works for them. But what is it telling us? What is it telling us about your worth versus your relationship status? And I do think that even if the end game in like Love Island, say, isn't necessarily marriage, and for some couples they do get married and that's lovely, but just sort of to couple up effectively, whereas in the church, almost always, if a couple is going to be together, they're sort of not end game, that's such awful language, but they're working towards marriage, on the whole. I would say that that's reflected. I would say that the world and the church share this kind of idea that single is unsuccessful, single is left on the shelf, single is unchosen and undesirable. And I think that that's a real shame, and it's somewhere where the church could really step out. But I haven't seen that happen well.
Or if there is an elevation of singleness, it's singleness as defiance and independence from need. I don't need anybody else. I'm single. Like, why would I want to be with someone else when I am enough in myself? And actually, as you rightly said, that's not necessarily a healthy goal either. There's supposed to be intimacy, connection, because without that, we're drawn back towards our earlier part of what we were saying about addictions, where there's a starvation of connection, love, intimacy. We'll try to find that somewhere else, in substances, and equally, if we're not getting that in our marriage, we'll still turn to our substances or pornography to satisfy that desire in us.
Yeah. Just so you know, I've probably only got another 10 minutes. Is that okay?
That's fine. Yeah. We're over time anyway. I'm just eking out as much as I can, and then it's useful if I've got a lot, because then I can edit out all the weird things I said about Louise Perry, and other bits and pieces. So I mean, part of the challenge that we're very aware of, I think, in the Western church in particular, is because of our culture's obsession with romantic love and sex, and its elevation, therefore, that's a human need to have sex. And we as Christians say, oh no, you can't do that unless you're married, and therefore you must get married. And and actually the problem that the church is facing is we need to create robust, intimate friendships to make singleness plausible and
Yeah.
enjoyable and fulfilling and meaningful.
Yeah.
Otherwise, what right have we got to say our gay friends that you shouldn't have sex? Because what we're denying them in their eyes is intimacy, because that's what our culture is talking to us about. So let's just maybe talk about this. How have you then managed to cultivate meaningful intimacy and connection outside of marriage?
Yeah, that's the issue, isn't it? Because say I said now, like, okay, I've actually decided that I won't be pursuing romantic. I've actually decided now that I won't be pursuing romantic relationships. I'm going to commit to being single. And to me, that sounds like a sentence. It sounds like a sentence to loneliness, when really, when we're doing it right, that's not what being single should look like. We need to design community, church community, in such a way that someone can be single but never alone and lonely. And that is something that we've just we hit and miss. And actually, I think our society and us in the church particularly, we confuse entertaining and hospitality, right? So entertaining is inviting someone 2 weeks in advance and checking your diary and turning on some music and maybe making 2 courses. There's a nice, we've knocked up a pavlova, even if you've just chucked some cream and berries on top of a shop bought meringue, but you've done it, and you put the kettle on afterwards, and you take their coat when they arrive, and oh no, don't do that, Jean, you sit down, I'll take the plates, right? That's
Jean is getting quite a lot of appearances today.
Yeah, Jean's big in the church game. All of that kind of stuff. And that's amazing. And we should do that. And it's so lovely to put on and make an effort for our friends and our family. But that's entertaining. Hospitality is, yeah, sure. Doors on the latch, unless you live in like somewhere where you can't keep the door on the latch. Head on in. We had a pasta bake yesterday, so it's leftovers. Chuck it in the microwave. Put your own dish in the dishwasher. I'm just running a bar for the kids, but after that, we're going to watch Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Like, join us, kind of thing. Like, everyone needs a home where they can just rock up, where no one's tidied before they get there, where they are not invited, they're just a part of, like the invitation is just implicit. And actually, like, it will need to be explicit a number of times before that sinks in, but the welcome should just be felt. They should just be able to turn up. And we're so focused on boundaries in our society now, and in Christian society, that we've created barriers against real connection. And you need those boundaries of the vast majority of people. But if you have kids, if you have a husband, if you have a wife, their job is to push your boundaries, like they are not going to adhere to your 1 hour quiet time, like you try and tell a 4-year-old about your 1 hour quiet time, and actually, like, that's what single people miss out on. They only get true connection when it's in its rightful, boundaried, invited place, when someone's cleaned up before they get there. And I just think, no, that's not what family is. You need 1 or 2 family homes where you've got a key, and for me, that's my sister's house. And it's, I guess, there are people who don't have that biological relationship where, not everyone gets great families and stuff, but church families there to do that. And I have got church family couples who I remember one couple, this is before they had a child, but I'm sure it would still stand. I was around their house and I was exhausted, and I was messaging my friend, and she was like, oh, I'm just going to leave the key under the mat. Like, just have a nap on my sofa before you do your thing this evening. Just go and have a nap. And I didn't even nap. I just watched New Girl and ate all the chocolate from their fridge. I mean, who keeps chocolate in the fridge anyway? They deserved it. But like, I needed that, I just needed someone. I just need people to open their home in that way. And if you as a family unit aren't doing that for someone, if there isn't someone who can treat your home like theirs, then maybe there should be. And if you as a single person don't have that dynamic where there's somewhere where you can just breathe and sink in and like, oh, I'll read the kids a story, or, you know, like, oh, don't worry about that, I'll chop these onions, you know, that kind of thing. Then actually like find it, develop it, express that that's a need for you, because that's how you won't feel alone.
That's really good. And I like your statement there. You got to find it, develop it. Like there's an intentionality on both parts
Yeah.
to find and develop this. Because I, you know, as a married man with kids, I'd be super keen for a lot of what you described. But finding it, developing it actually requires effort. And that, in the initiating part, there's going to be a lot of, like you said, you've got to keep inviting until it becomes, you've got to keep making it explicit until it becomes implicit. Command of the English language, Lauren. Very good. It's very, very good. I really like what you said, and I'm so grateful for everything you've shared today. It's just before we kind of wrap things up, is there anything like, I mean, I could ask you lots more questions about your book, and people should go out and buy your book. And actually, I mean, last year you spoke at New Day, and we're hoping, we haven't asked you yet, but we're hoping we can get you back at New Day this year. And we'd love to have you, please. In fact, while we're recording this, will you come to New Day in the summer?
I would love to come to New Day.
Great. There we go. It's
summer.
done, everybody. She has to come now.
That's locked in. Oh my goodness. Having said that, I'm just going to check my diary, because I think I've put the dates to my favorite ones already in, just in case I was going to be invited.
Wow.
Have you made
New
it?
Day in your favorite one? Let's find out.
Yeah, it's August. It's totally here. Great. I can see you. I can see you. Yes, I have you marked down. So I would love that. Thank you so much.
So you've heard it here first. What Lauren Windle is speaking at New Day in 2023. Probably the first confirmed speaker that's been announced this year, Lauren.
If I don't get a formal email to invite me now, then I'm going to be really offended.
This is your email. This is your email. Until 2 weeks before the event. Anyway, just as we draw things to a close for today, why don't you just share, is there anything on your heart or in your mind that you kind of want to leave us with?
Yeah, I think the final thing is, you know, we've covered, particularly in the early half of this, some quite heavy, quite life-affecting things for some people. And I would just say, if you are in a position where you're struggling with an addiction, or you think you might be struggling with an addiction, it is so important that you reach out and ask for help from someone. I don't know anyone who has gotten to a place of freedom completely in independence. I only know people who have worked through that with the support of other people who know how they're feeling. And I think it's so powerful to ask for help. And on my website, I've got a load of resources under, like, there's a little recovery page, and there's loads of buttons you can click there for charities, anonymous fellowships, Christian support systems, and things like that. And I think like maybe this is it. Maybe this is God. I think a lot of people, when it comes to addiction, pray and expect the lightning bolt, and expect that they're going to wake up and that's it. They do not have an issue with food anymore. They do not have an issue with alcohol anymore. Suddenly they're very balanced and they no longer want to watch pornography. When actually I think those stories happen. But I think what's far more likely is that God is providing you with the tools to put in the work, to develop your character, to develop your relationship with him, and to work towards that freedom. And maybe this is God saying, like, here's the tools. Go and find one of those charities, speak to someone who you trust in your church, you know, reach out to leadership, you know, contact someone who understands what you're feeling and where you've been, and share with them honestly. And start on that road, and you'll never regret it. Your life is so valuable. You know, Jesus really did sacrifice everything so that you could have that freedom. So walk in it, claim it, work towards it, and develop that relationship with God so that you can feel that full freedom.
Oh man, preach it. Thank you so much, Lauren Windle, for your time today.